I'm Patrick Williams with Cannabis Business Times and the Cannabis Conference, and I'm honored and excited to be moderating this conversation with cultivators in Ohio's medical market. This panel will provide some insights into practices and techniques being utilized in Ohio cannabis cultivation and how cultivation approaches fit into the broader supply chain and cannabis industry as a whole. Today, I'm pleased to moderate the discussion with Christine Dejesus, Director of Cultivation at Galenas, Matt Kispert, on the end VP of Cultivation at Buckeye Relief, and Jason Kabbes, Founder and Senior VP at Ohio Clean Leaf. Each person is going to share some information about their company, but first I just have a few quick questions for the audience. With a show of hands, could you guys tell me how many of you are in the cannabis industry working for a plant touching business or ancillary business? Great. And how many of you are patients or caregivers? Perfect. And how many are here interested in launching a company? Perfect. And how many of you are just curious about learning more? Great. Thank you so much. So, just as a quick housekeeping note, we'll be saving some time at the end for audience questions, so our panel can answer any questions that you may have. So I'll start off with Christine. Could you tell us briefly a little bit about yourself and about Galenas, just for a minute or so?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. It's good to see everybody here at OCHBS. I'm excited about this event. It's a wonderful event so far, so I'm super excited to see you all. So I'm Director of Cultivation for Galenas. We're a Tier 2 grow located in Akron, Ohio. We're actually I think we're still the only organic grow in the state. We grow in live soil, excuse me, and we're certified kind. So certified kind is a third party that certifies our cannabis as organic. So it parallels all the USDA organic standards. So everything, any input that we use in the grow has to be certified organic, or certified for organic agriculture, basically. So let's see, what else can I say? Excuse me. My voice might be a little cracky when I'm talking today. I just want to let you know right now. I'm kind of still recovering from COVID last month, so a little asthma going on. But I'm super excited to be here. Like I mentioned, Galenas is a Tier 2 grow. We're vertical, so we're growing on 3 tiers currently, which is quite a feat with soil. So it's great to be here, and I'll pass it over to Jason.
Thank you. Hey, Jason Kabbes, Senior Vice President of Ohio Clean Leaf and CEO of Diamond Science Extracts. Ohio Clean Leaf is also a Tier 2 cultivator. We're all the way down to Dayton, Ohio. We're just a group of cannabis enthusiasts that got really, really lucky to get a license, and we're just really happy to do what we love to do. Big lovers of the plant. We grow really kind of old school. We're not very industrial scale. We still water by hand. We have hand trimmed every single bud that's gone out of our facility since inception. And yeah, like I said, we're just absolute lovers of the plant and just very enthusiastically try to grow the cleanest, most awesome weed that we can. And that's pretty much it. Happy to be here today, happy to talk about whatever it is that we're going to talk about, and yeah, just stoked to do it.
Great. Matt?
Hello, my name is Matt Kispert. I am the Vice President of Cultivation with Buckeye Relief. We are a level 1 cultivator, so we're a little bit bigger than the level 2s. We were the first to harvest in the state. We're a single ownership company. Most everybody in the company is from Ohio. It's been fun watching the company grow from the 12 people that it was when I joined the team to, I think we have 120 just on the cultivation site right now, plus our dispensaries that we're opening. So we're very much growing along with the industry in Ohio, and it's been super fun to see. I want to thank everybody for coming out to this. It's always great to get these kind of events together. I feel like as cultivators, we probably don't get enough time in front of the patients that we're here to serve, so it's always a pleasure and an opportunity to talk in front of everybody.
Great. So, Christine, I know you started cultivating cannabis with Galenas a few years ago. What have you learned about cultivating in this program over the years?
So I would say that when I first started 3.5 years ago, I transitioned from traditional agriculture. So I ran a farm for Great Lakes Brewing Company for about 13 years. Prior, it was all outdoors, and it was also organic. And I guess when I started off, my assumptions were that everything was going to be very different than traditional agriculture, but actually I found after a few cycles that things had a lot more in common with mainstream agriculture. A lot of the things that I was kind of concerned about using indoors, like compost, indoors, so that was a pleasant surprise, of course. And then cannabis, I've grown just about everything. I've grown hops, about 30 or 40 different types of vegetables. I've grown fruit, I've grown a lot of medicinal herbs and culinary herbs. And so taking on cannabis at commercial scale for the first time 3.5 years ago, again, I was kind of intimidated in a way, thinking that maybe this was this kind of magical, mystical plant that was going to have different requirements than anything I had grown thus far. But as it turned out, it's very similar to most other crops. As long as you pay it the right amount of attention, put a lot of things in on the preventative side, so especially with organic agriculture, we're doing pest suppression in a preventative way. And as long as you really pay the attention and learn from the plants in each cycle, kind of take that bit of R&D that you've used previously and make sure that you're correcting any errors that you may have had the first time. It's a very responsive plant. It's actually pretty easy to grow overall. But I also grow in soil, which is different than hydroponic growing, so soil's more forgiving, and it has its own challenges, but it also is a very natural way to grow. So it's easy in a sense because there's a lot of stability in the soil. So.
Jason and Matt, what have been some of the largest lessons for you guys cultivating? And could you tell us how long each of you have been cultivating cannabis in this program?
You want to start?
Sure. I've been cultivating cannabis in the program since the program basically started. Before that, like Christine, I was in traditional agriculture. I was running a hydroponic greenhouse, growing a variety of vegetables, tomatoes, bell peppers, my personal favorite, jalapenos. I guess the biggest challenge transitioning from that side of agriculture to cannabis-specific agriculture was like the limitation on available resources. So I came from a setup where if I had a problem with a crop, I could reach out to the local university and they say, hey, I'm having this pathogen outbreak. What should I do? What are some recommendations that you have? Can I send you samples to identify the disease for me? With the cannabis industry though, a lot of that is kind of closed off. We don't have those sort of classical resources that the rest of the ag industry has. Everything that we do has to go through certified labs. If we want to have a tissue sample, I don't even know that there's a single lab in the state that does nutrient analysis on tissue. So, identifying a nutrient deficiency in your crop is kind of left up to either you to do in-house testing on, or you just kind of go with your gut and test what you can within the confines of the system put forth by the state. So I guess overcoming those hurdles and navigating this space was probably the biggest challenge that we had.
Just as a quick follow-up question, the lack of tissue sample analysis, is that a regulatory legal condition, or is that just the way it's shaken out that hasn't been?
It's a little bit of both. So on the one hand, only certified labs in Ohio can handle cannabis material, and I don't believe any of the labs in Ohio that we use for testing offer that as a service. There are dozens of labs in the state that do tissue analysis for crops and agricultural materials. Just we can't access them because they're not licensed to touch cannabis.
Sure. Jason, what have you learned in this program? And I understand you have some involvement in other states as well. Could you just talk about what you've learned cultivating cannabis in this program, and then also just more broadly?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you mentioned, I work in some other states. I'm an Ohio native, but I live in Oregon, and I first got my cultivation license in Oregon in 2010. So over a decade of cultivation experience in that regard. What I'd say I've learned about cultivation just generally since this program has started, what I've just been diving down is vertical cultivation. Not just in your veg state, but flowering on multiple levels and how to actually do that best and eliminate microenvironments and stuff like that. But what I've learned specifically within the Ohio program, I'll be honest, what I've learned is this program, it's somewhat industrialized. There's a lot of big companies here. But at the end of the day, who actually grows the best cannabis is still very, very, very important. So just staying very, very true to quality, very, very true to the stuff that these two folks care about as well, is something that you can't sacrifice, in my opinion. We're a smaller grower, so we have to be quality focused. And since we've kind of stayed so true to that quality mantra, I think that's provided us staying power. As the industry industrializes, as things go up in scale, I think that's something unique is to maintain quality.
Great. Jason, could you also talk about how Ohio Clean Leaf's product selection has changed over time? Has it changed over time to match what patients are looking for? And has the program in general matured as far as what patients are looking for and kind of those common categories of flower and concentrates?
Sure, yeah, sure. Has the program matured from a patient standpoint? Absolutely. I say this a lot of the time, even when I'm out of Ohio. I think Ohio has a very educated patient base here, relatively speaking. I think there are a lot of connoisseurs within the patient base here that actually want quality cannabis. And I think that's a lot of their complaints about this program is that there's just not enough quality. There's plenty of supply, but I think they want more quality is what they're actually looking for. But I'm sorry, as far as how has the program evolved, it's definitely evolved. At first, all the dispensaries, or for the most part, they're all independently owned. And then eventually, a lot of them can consolidate. So there's a lot more pressure to make top shelf product, high in THC, to actually be able to get into the retail stores. So we've probably changed our genotypes in the house to lean more towards those high THC varieties. Whereas me, as a purist, I don't always go after high THC. I go after high terpenes. I go after medical efficacy as well. So I think that's something that we've tried to just maintain, is that we care about quality, we care about medical efficacy, but we also just want to zero in on those strains that can do that as well as exhibit the high THC numbers.
Sure, and we've done some reporting on that, kind of the question of THC and terpenes and all of that, what are people looking for and then what are businesses doing? So Matt and Christine, could you talk about that a little bit? What have been your practices with that? Are you focused on THC mainly, or are you also focused on terpenes or more on terpenes? Could you just talk a little bit about that?
I'd say it's a bit of tug of war. So there's definitely the group of us that are terpene chasers. We have a couple of varieties that we're clutching, to our grave that we will not get rid of because they're the terpene profiles that they have and the unique nature of the effects that they produce. But this is also, we have to keep the lights on. So there is, in most of the markets, Ohio not being excluded from that, a lot of people that also chase potency predominantly. And it's kind of a question of, sales, where what patient group is going to be the most vocal. Are the people that are chasing terpenes going to be more vocal than the people that are chasing potency? I think that a big part of it, and I'm not speaking from any formal standpoint here, but I would like to hope that with an increase in education, that the patient base will begin to understand more of the entourage effect that happens with the plant and figure out, what particular combinations of cannabinoids works for them and the issues that they're trying to solve. And that in of itself will probably lead to more chasing of terpenes and a better understanding of it's more than just a single number on the side of a jar. I think right now it's a little easier to look at a jar and be like, okay, this is 25%, 28% is higher than that, so it must be better. I think it's going to come down to the dispensary workers working with the patients and just everyone kind of getting used to the effects that they're receiving as they navigate all of the plethora of products that are available to them to figure out what it is that they want. And then that will in turn get relayed to us, the growers, and then we'll hopefully be able to supply people with that.
Yeah, that's kind of the same situation that we have in Galenas. People, when I interact with people in public, with patients, they generally are always talking about that they're interested in high terpene cultivars, but at the end of the day, sales is always driven by high potency cultivars. So it's kind of it's kind of a tough balance to, you know, bring in unique low THC strains that have a complex terpene profile, because they're still sitting on the shelves, and you know the clientele that we're serving are telling us that they're preferring, of course, the high THC, very potent strains. So it's kind of difficult to navigate still when it's such a potency-driven market. What I've tried to focus on at Galenas is getting higher terpene numbers from those same potent strains. So we've done a lot of work at Galenas to continue to try and enhance the terpene profile through different cultivation methods. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, some different techniques, but that's been a main focus of mine, is to do a lot of research into what methods can we use to really increase those terpene numbers in our very potent strains. So I think it is possible. We've seen terpene numbers at Galenas. Since I started 3.5 years ago, we were averaging below 2% across all cultivars, and now we're averaging like 3.5% over, like our last 2 harvests, we averaged 3.5% over all cultivars. So it's definitely possible to enhance the profiles through different types of cultivation techniques, but also through how you're handling the product in the dry room, how you're handling the product after drying, to preserve the content of the terpenes that are in those products and make sure that they make it to the consumer, basically.
Definitely. So I know in cultivation, it's obviously imperative to avoid problems and grows, and a few of those problems are pests, so insects and mites, and then diseases and viruses. And that can be done through practices like integrated pest management, or IPM. Matt, could you tell us what IPM is, and just from kind of a high level, and then how do you keep at Buckeye Relief insects, diseases, and viruses out of there?
So the whole concept of integrated pest management is integrated. So basically you take cultural practices, stuff like the clothing that you wear when you're around the canopy, around the plants, shoes, clothes, not allowing people to bring in like hats, outside clothing, stuff like that. Washing your hands, physical barriers that you have to go through to get from the outside to the inside, all of those are like cultural barriers. There's also like pest management, so using varieties that are resistant to diseases is kind of the first step with that, and then being able to identify diseases as they occur before they get past the point of no return where you need to act more aggressively on them. It's kind of an all-encompassing approach to, first and foremost, minimize risk, and then respond in the quickest way possible to issues as they arise. You do that, and then you don't ever find yourself in kind of an oh-no scenario where you have to do something dramatic like terminate a room or something like that. So the major approach that we take at Buckeye is one from the cultural side. So a little bit of my background, I was working with Ohio State to come up with a good agricultural practices manual for hydroponic crop production, and a lot of that leans heavily on actually Canadian HACCP programs, where they're looking at, HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. So you're basically identifying every single step along the way of a process in which that process could be exposed to a potential contaminant. And then once you identify those, you figure out ways of preventing contamination to happen at that event, and also minimizing the number of events that possible contamination could occur. So what that looks like on the cultivation side is we all wear laundered uniforms. We have shoes that are only worn inside. We wash those shoes every single week, like physically wash them, sanitize them. We have an IPM team that is always walking through all of our rooms, just looking at the plants, trying to identify problems ahead of time. We have a reporting system set up to allow us to very quickly communicate issues as they're seen to the necessary people, and then log that information so we can develop patterns and figure out what is causing this problem to appear in the first place. And then we have protocols to follow once those issues are identified. So it all kind of works in concert to allow us to operate relatively problem-free. We've had challenges, especially in the beginning of the program, but I think that each challenge represents an opportunity for us to further refine our practices, and we're only getting better every single day. And a big part of it though, and this is something that you can't, I guess, purchase or anything, is just the attitude of the workers and the culture that's involved. IPM hinges on people that when they see something, they say something. And it's the difference between when you're walking down the street and you see a piece of garbage on the ground, do you walk past it or do you pick it up? Every single person on our team, we hope, is the type of individual that would reach down and pick it up, because that's the type of attitude that's needed to maintain the level of cleanliness that we strive for.
So, labor is a frequently discussed topic in the U.S. economy, and relatedly so is diversity, equity, and inclusion in employment and ownership of businesses. Christine, what should job applicants, expect out of cultivation roles here in Ohio, and how can there be more DEI in the state's cannabis businesses?
So the cannabis industry in Ohio, just like it is nationwide, is still not a very diverse industry. Actually, in many cases, it's been going backwards. Like the percentage of women in leadership positions has dropped dramatically since 2018 or 2019. I think it was almost, I think it's down to like 6% of leadership positions in cannabis companies are held by women. And of course, the racial diversity in the industry is very poor still. So as someone that's actually actively hiring people and bringing people in on the entry level and up, I think it's really important to not only obviously keep that in mind at all times, but to maybe go outside of traditional networks to look for applicants for those roles. So versus just putting posts on Indeed or kind of taking the easiest path to bringing new people into your facility, to really dig deeper, really look into your community, find areas where people that you can reach out to. Like for example, one thing we did at Galenas was reach out to a local urban farm community called Riddle Farm and try and bring interns and applicants in that were already involved in agriculture in these urban farm areas and give them basically a chance with cannabis. So it requires more active work to recruit people, but the benefit is, unbelievable, of course, when you look out and you have this diverse team and diverse group of people that can bring experiences from different communities and different histories into the grow. It is still a huge challenge, obviously, and it's something that I think events like this really help with as well. So networking, supporting Black and Brown owned businesses and organizations is really important to keep us all networking together so that we can reach those untapped markets that maybe traditional outlets aren't reaching.
So I'm going to tee up a question for Matt that we often ask for one of Cannabis Business Time's web sections called Cannabis Workspace. Are there any specific cultivation techniques that you and your team are currently really interested in, and is there anything that you're actively studying a lot?
Well, specific cultivation techniques, things we're kind of excited for. Something we're playing with right now at a very small level is like different types of supplemental lighting. So looking at UV light for finishing, looking at far red light for height control. We play around with lighting to a small degree. Again, being a production facility, we don't have a super dedicated production or research and development space, so it's kind of just a corner of a room that we get to play around in. But we're always trying to come up with new ways to make the plants that we have perform better. And as we discover new genetics that we're excited about, figuring out ways to, I guess, make them operate within the confines of our facility. Probably the most exciting thing that we've done, just from like a geeky cultivation side, was height control in cannabis. So we have a limitation on the size of the plants that we can produce because of the nature of the growing system, right? There's 6 feet that I have between the tables and our lights, so we have to have plants that finish in between that height range. We have seen phenotypes come through our facility that have far exceeded that 6 foot height.
You're okay.
So we were like, okay, well let's start taking measurements. So we started doing weekly height measurements where every single week we go out and we measure the heights of the plants and then we chart their growth and see how they progress. And we realized that most of the varieties that we grow, they stop gaining height at around 5 weeks after flower initiation. We have a couple of varieties that don't do that though, they just continue to get taller and taller and taller. So they're also varieties that are near and dear to us. So what can we do to save these plants and be able to continue to grow them in our facility? Well, let's dust off some old manuals that I have from my tomato days and see if those techniques apply to this. So we started brushing the tops of them. That's physically like taking a broomstick and knocking the tops of the plants when they're in veg, and we noticed, okay, we can get about 6-inch reduction off of that. It's not sustainable to pay somebody to run around with a broomstick and smack the top of 10,000 plants though. So could we automate this? So then we start playing around with automation techniques with it, and our current iteration of that right now is like a high-speed fan that we have that kicks on a timer, and it just bursts air at the top of the canopy and knocks the canopy over in the same fashion that the broomstick does. And we're hoping that that is going to be a more viable way to control height in some of these higher value plants. Ultimately, we still have to look for short plants, but this might be able to get us to be able to save some of the taller plants that we are fond of.
So at Galenas, something that I've been working a lot with, as I mentioned earlier, was enhancing terpene expression in plants. So a couple things that I've been playing around with that have been working out pretty well are basically like hyper cooling our rooms start to finish. So in the last 10 days or so of production, we've been bringing the temperature down really low, particularly the night temperature down low, so like down into like the mid 60s. And another thing that I've had really good success with is drought stressing the plants. Stressing plants in any way is always kind of a risky game because they're already under a lot of stress, particularly when they're grown indoors. There's all kinds of stresses just in growing in that artificial environment. So I personally don't like to play with too much plant stress in early flower or in veg, because that's like the time when your plant is really building the architecture and it's getting to its maximum health so it can really flower out and get your strong yields. But in mid to late flower, I found that particularly in like the 7th and 8th week, if you induce some pretty heavy drought stress, you can see pretty dramatic terpene enhancement. And I've had a couple strains that I've done kind of like side-by-side experiments with, and I found an increase of over 1.5% in total terpene production just from like one intense episode of drought stress in either week 7 or week 8. Every cultivar reacts differently, and generally you don't want to stress the plants to the point, or you can kind of bring them almost to wilt point or a little bit past wilt point, but some plants will sustain permanent damage after they wilt, and they'll never be able to yield the same or produce the same quality that they would had you not induced that stress. But if you're careful, if you of course are keeping your data collection really accurate across all strains, we grow a lot of different strains in the same rooms, then you can really kind of play around with that on the next turn and see like kind of how far you can take it. So that's been like an interesting experiment for us.
That's super cool. It kind of sounds like you're referring to crop steering, really, if you're familiar with the term.
Yep.
Yeah, so crop steering is just really playing with the different stressors in the plant, whether it's your change in temperature as a function of time, the actual temperature range. You can really keep your plant short and squatty and shoot out more shoots if you do specific stressors, and you can induce flowering, excuse me, and induce maturation if you play around with other stressors later on in the cycle. So yeah, that's something we've been looking into as well as crop steering and how that can actually not just help with terpene expression, but even just color expression of the plants and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's something we're absolutely looking into. And I agree with Christine, making stuff cold at the end of the cycle does kick out terpene expression a little bit. You know, if you think about it, terpenes are really the female plant's natural ability to attract a pollinator, okay? And if that plant is actually feeling a specific type of stress at the end of its life cycle, it's going to have more of the cells within that plant, the brain within those cells is going to tell that plant that it needs to reproduce more, right? So that's actually a way that the plant has to attract pollinators, is to kick out extra terpenes. So that's super interesting. As far as terpene preservation, we're also getting into, you know, longer curing, cold curing, playing around with our cure times to see, you know, the second set of terpenes express about 8 weeks after harvest, stuff like that. So kind of going down that rabbit hole a little bit. Once again, very big on terpenes. I love THC, but very, very big on terpenes over here. A couple other areas though that we've been focused on, like I mentioned early, vertical growing. Really interested in that and different ways to vertically grow. Eliminating microenvironments, you know, whether you're using many different point sources through your HVAC, or introducing maybe a duct sock along, you know, your vertical rack. Just playing around with different sorts of infrastructures there. And then lastly, sorry, I have a degree in geochemistry and geophysics from Ohio State, so I'm super nerdy. I'm really getting into tissue culture a lot. And not necessarily as a means of propagation, but more so as a means of cleansing. You know, because stuff happens. No matter how good you are, no matter how clean you are, if people are coming in and out of your building, stuff's gonna happen eventually. So I think, you know, what we're personally interested in looking into is, okay, if something does happen, what can we do within this building to actually mitigate that on a long-term basis? And having a teeny tiny little tissue culture lab can actually go a long way when it comes to preserving your genetic stock year over year.
Definitely. So, assuming everything goes right in a specific cultivation cycle, what are the indicators that it's time to harvest, and then what happens after that in the process at Ohio Clean Leaf? Jason?
Sure, yeah. I mean, as far as indicators, I'm looking for a lot of, you know, terpene volatilization, you know, when stuff gets super stinky. I look at the colors of the stigma, you know, to kind of be changing over to the ratio that I think they should be, but really more so than anything, we're gonna get our magnifying glass out and look at the resin glands. So we're looking for a particular ratio of glands to actually be amber trichomes, definitely not clear trichomes, not just only milky, but a certain percentage of those we want to actually have turned amber. That's what we consider the plant to be ripe, to be ready for harvesting. And then, yeah, once it's harvested, I mean, we kind of do a slow cure. You know, we big leave everything right away, hang it for about 14 days, and then we start curing. And we burp, you know, several times throughout the cure, but once we think it's where it should be, that's when we send it off. And it's not always the fastest process. You know, sometimes you harvest something and heck, you want to get it out the door and see some revenue, but we just don't want to we don't want to sacrifice that quality aspect on our end. So that cold cure is something that that cool cure, I would call it. That cool cure is something that we're really trying to nail down. The perfect temperature, perfect humidity, perfect redox conditions, and perfect amount of time.
Matt, is it freeze-dried that Buckeye Relief introduced? Could you speak to that, or is that a different part of the company that they're doing that process with?
So I don't directly oversee that part of it, but that was kind of a thought experiment that a couple of the processing guys kicked around probably 2 years ago now, that we kind of joked about it and then started looking at it more seriously, and then started running trials on it, and then now we're not anywhere near a large-scale production component of it. It's kind of a novelty, both inside and outside of the company at this point, but it's really interesting in concept, and we're trying to figure out, I guess, where that lies on the scale of the product quality as far as that goes, because like slow cure is absolutely tried and true methodology. Freeze drying, you know, you take a plant that we just literally we harvest it, we take that plant, we rapid freeze it. We're talking like, you know, liquid nitrogen, super fast freeze it, and then it goes into the freeze dryer almost immediately and gets dried down to the point where it's a finished product within 24 hours. So that's really interesting. It's different though. Like, I don't know if anyone here has ever like checked out our freeze dried stuff. It smells awesome. Like, it maintains that. The coloration is insane because there's no slow drying process. There's not all of that microbial degradation that occurs and oxidation of the different pigments. So a perfect example of this You take, your like purple pigments, and as those slowly oxidize, they turn like a reddish brown color almost. But if you take that purple pigment in plants and you freeze dry it, it is purple, like purple. Like there's no confusing it for a different color, a shade color. So the like visual aesthetics of freeze dried product is insane. But aesthetics isn't something that you should lean on alone. So we're still playing around with it, trying to see, is this going to be a good product at the end of the day, or is it just a novelty? But it's cool so far.
Sure. Christine, could you talk a little bit about post-harvest processes? Do you automate at Galenas trimming and packaging and all of that, or is that done by you?
Excuse me. Since we're still a relatively small company, we don't have a whole lot of automation in packaging. We did start off with machine trimming, but we've since switched over to hand trimming everything. So all of our product now gets a total hand trim. We found that it was just gentler on the product, produced a higher quality product, and also that we actually generated a higher percentage of flower to trim. So the machine trimming was generating a lot of trim, like 30 to 35% trim. And with hand trimming, we've been able to bring that down to like 15%. So we're also able to have more flower to sell on the market. And then another thing that we experimented with, and I mean, we've had so many obviously rooms that we've dried, but we did start off with a 14-day dry. So the plants were staying in the dry room for 14 days. And then we did some data analysis over a couple of different harvests and found actually that with a faster dry, we had almost 1% higher terpene values. So across the same cultivars. So we actually sped up our drying process so that we can have the plants out in 8 days versus 14. And we found that that has shown us substantially higher terpene numbers. So I think there's, like maybe some off-gassing that happens of volatile oils generally that, when you tighten up that period, even at the same temperature, you're able to preserve it more. We do more cold chain work though. I mean, nothing like the liquid nitrogen and all the fresh, or the process, the cryogenic process, but we do try and keep our dry room cool, obviously, and then lowering the temperature of the flower rooms to that same dry room temperature, so trying to bring it as close to 60 degrees as possible in production, and then even continuing that a bit into the trim room so that cold chain kind of continues from the last 10 days of flower through when the product's actually packaged, has also done a lot to preserve terpenes as well. So it's a little bit of an adjustment for the employees, obviously, especially in the flower rooms toward the end when people are, getting a little chilly, obviously working on the plants and stripping them down, but we found that it's really worth it. It pays off with the terpene preservation.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Does anyone have a question? And as far as microphones, do we know what the situation is there? All right, shout it out. Go ahead.
I had a question about the freeze drying. Have you noticed with chlorophyll left over, because of how you were saying that the visual aesthetic of it, is the chlorophyll making that herb more harsh on the lungs and the throat? Because chlorophyll does that?
So actually the feedback that we've gotten is that it's less harsh. I can't speak to the science on it, but almost everyone at our work and people that we've communicated with on the dispensary side outside of work that has tried it, they've all basically have the same opinion that it's like substantially less harsh.
And I have a follow-up question on that. Also on the freeze drying, the terpene profile, is it going to smell more like the fresh herb, or does it eventually change like in the regular curing process, how certain strains, when you're harvesting them, they can be almost noxious? Like, do you ever notice, do some of the strains now have too strong of a terpene profile that should have actually had that longer cure process that will kind of make it a gentler smell?
I don't know that we've had anything that's been too strong. I would say that it's more representative of what they smell like as a live plant.
Like a raw plant.
And it's really interesting because we have a couple varieties, like our pineapple upside down cake is probably one of my favorite things that we grow. It's also one of our lowest potency varieties out there, so we sell it in like big jars and ounces and everything. But that one freeze dried, it smells more like a live plant, and once it's regular, when it goes through the regular drying process, a lot of the more volatile terpenes, they volatilize and disappear, and so you're left with the more stable terpenes like caraphyllene and all those more like peppery, I guess, intense terpenes that are left behind, while the more floral ones tend to volatilize. When the freeze dry, those floral ones don't, so it's almost like softer and nicer in a way, like the freeze dried pineapple anyway.
Was there another question over here? Go ahead.
Could you guys walk us through the pheno hunt process, and what types of things do you guys prioritize during your pheno hunt process?
Question was about pheno hunting and what's prioritized during that.
So when we were talking in our Zoom call prior to this discussion, one thing that came up was how hard it really is to do R&D in the layouts that we have right now. Because obviously, particularly in a small grow, the space is so limited, like every square foot matters. So it's really hard to run pheno hunts. That's something that if regulations could loosen, could obviously enhance production substantially. There's equipment now that you can do, of course, in-house testing for the THC and terpene values. We don't have that yet between us, I'd love to. But that's one way, of course, to speed up the process and be able to do it in a more controlled environment. But what we've done just at Galenas is we've ran, seed lots, obviously, and selected. We've done this each run, especially recently, in smaller batches so that we don't have to sacrifice so much space. But we have like a grading system basically, and look at each plant from seed and note, how fit is it for commercial production. So how tall does it grow? How well does it veg? How leafy is the plant? But then also, how does the flower look? What's like the bag of yield? And get it potency tested, see where it stands with potency and terpenes, and then even carry it into other aspects of production, like how hard is it to trim? How do the terpenes carry over through the dry and cure? How well does it root in propagation? How long does it take to root? So it's really just an intense amount of data collection. A lot of it is pretty obvious. Like we have a strain called I-71 that's coming up that was everybody's favorite instantly in the pheno hunt process because it just smelled so good. And the hype gets there real soon when you're starting to run a few smaller batches of things. And sometimes it's just clear that it's a winner, but other times it takes a long time to really kind of tease out the best plants for production.
I'm sorry, we're gonna have to wrap up here. I don't know if you guys might be up for answering some questions out the stage, but we got another panel coming up. Thank you so much, all three of you.